So when we think about like other solutions, right? A lot of what we had talked about, it's a lot of like internal processes that can come in, and because we focus a lot on organizations, right? So the police have a lot of internal security use that they can use to protect it, whether that's through a number of people choosing not to report it. They make it difficult. There's a culture that's against reforms and things like that. All of those matter, and they can hamper one's ability to seek out and put in checks for police reform. So there's often really like two other external factors. So external means of controlling behavior. So the first one, focuses on a lawsuit. And so what usually ends up happening is that, if it's assumed that people, are under, they're acting as an officer, so that has to be the case. And that there is some, violation of their duties, right? So they, beat people who shouldn't have been beaten. They search people who shouldn't have been searched. They arrested people that should have been arrested, something like that. And so what you can do then is sue them, right? And usually you can sue the officer. You can sue the department and the city for damages. So the goal is to get a financial kind of background. So you want some financial part. But it is also a civil case. So this is not something that what can end up it's not something that you can like get prison time for necessarily for an officer. So with this, we have like a few things that are sort of like related to this case, right? Is like one, normally the city takes over. And usually, a lot of times, right, the lawsuits are directed. They name the agency or the city because they have the most cash, right? And so, not to say that like it should always be about money, because it isn't. But more often than not, you're motivated to do that because it can be very time consuming and take many years in order to litigate a case. And so when it goes to a city like this, right, outcomes favor the department, or the city in this case, right? Because they have a larger legal system. They have a lot more resources to do that. They can drain you of cash unless you have the financial wherewithal or some outside benefactor coming in and protecting you from doing it. It's easy to get beat down. So these are often, favored by police departments, right? The other part, too, is that this is simply a civil thing, and there's no action to the police officer. So because the city takes over or the department takes over, so there's no like reprimand of the officer itself. Rather, what ends up happening is that they focus on the city, and the officer continues about their business. They take care of it in court, and things are like no big deal, right? So that was a weird, sorry about that. So, the thing that ends up happening then is that you have these situations where there's no like real relief, right? And, it's kind of stacked against you. So even though, especially if you consider that a lot of times police abuse is going to happen to people who are, in the most vulnerable or poor situations, it takes a lot for a case to be brought up to begin with. And, to say that, okay, now you have to do a multi-year, like court decision. That's going to drain you of all your funds. It's really stacked against anyone, having some sort of injunction. And even then, right, the only injunction or relief that you can seek is through a lawsuit. It doesn't do anything to correct the police department. It doesn't do anything to correct the officer. It doesn't do anything to the city. And a lot of times police departments have insurance that will cover out any settlements that come out of this anyway. So it's not exactly the best in terms of identifying, rectifying the extent of a problem within a police department. That, though, the single best way, or I guess the tends to be the most effective way is through the federal consent decree process. And this is an area that I do some research in, and I think it's really important, so that's why we're included here. So we think about like the federal consent decree program and something that's like happening with it. We're just going to turn this off so there's no Wi-Fi real quick. So no more email notifications. So when we have this federal consent decree program, what ends up happening is a couple things, right? So this is reserved for the worst of the worst in police agencies. So for worst of worst. And what they end up trying to do is that they will investigate any agency, so an agency who attracts attention. Sometimes this is a complaint, sometimes this is going to be like someone reported something, sometimes it's, someone was asked, the police department will solicit an investigation. But more often than not, this is going to be about media reports that come in. So people make a claim, there's a spat or spate of behavior that's going on that's unacceptable. It attracts the attention of the Department of Justice, and the Special Litigation Unit of the Civil Rights Division will come to investigate. So what they end up doing, right, is that for any agency that attracts their attention, there is an investigation that comes into place. And they more or less, are looking, and this phrasing is key, a pattern or practice of police misconduct. So something that is long-standing, long-lasting, and is harmful, right, in such a way that it, really provides a detriment to the society, right, in some way, right? So something that, wasn't like a little goof-off thing. It's a pretty serious deal. So more often than not, the kinds of issues that pop up, as you might imagine, are issues with searches and seizures, right? So people are illegally searching people, they're illegally seizing people, things like that. You have rudeness, and as well, police use of force, with the goal being that these behaviors need to be corrected. So if we think about this actual process, right, what ends up happening is that they come up with this consent decree, right? So a lot of things are required in this, right? One, is going to be, there has to be this agreement to focus on the actual problem, right? So you have to fix XYZ behavior, whatever it is. Usually they want to be done in 5 years, but there are instances where they last much longer. In some cases it could be 7 years, some cases it could be 14 years. It could be, a really significant, long period of time. And so their goal is to do it, but it really requires a lot of institutional change. So the agency has to make a lot of changes. They have to make changes in culture, to make changes in their policy. They have to retrain officers. There's a lot that goes on into making sure that no harms can be continued by a department. And their process is monitored over a period of years by a judge and an outside monitor. They go in and say, hey, are you meeting the terms of the agreement? Are you doing everything needed in order to limit the misbehavior in the future? And are you improving, right? So once compliant, agencies have to show, they have to maintain that behavior for 2 years. So the goal is to get an agency fully compliant in 3 years, and then the last 2 years show that you can maintain the changes so that you don't regress in the future. And in this case, then, right, it's seen, in some cases, agencies don't really like it, right? It feels invasive. It feels like, wow, people are coming in, they're checking out our department, they don't understand what it's really like. Some officers become disgruntled. There's a fear that leads to more crime, although there really isn't any evidence to suggest that. But the point being is that the goal then is to reduce police misconduct. So, important things to consider, right? So this is really the most invasive, it's the most intrusive, agency thing, because there's really not a lot of oversight, at the state level that can handle or correct for this, right? So it really is up to the federal government. And even though, there are 18,000, agencies in the United States about, right? It's something, I think the last time I checked, right? We'll say there have been 35-ish that have actually gone through, they were targeted and participated with reform. So with that then, right, because there's this participation with reform, because they're targeting a certain amount of agencies that come into place, right, this creates, it's not really a lot, right? You really can't target a lot of them. The federal government doesn't provide any financial assistance, so an agency is often, will drag their feet, kind of grumble about it, things like that. Having said that, though, a lot of major cities are targeted, and so it's believed that about 20% of the U.S. population has lived underneath an agency that has been targeted, right? So it does affect a significant number of lives, in the United States, right? And if you think about some notable cases, right, this has been used in Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore, DC, LA, Detroit, Ferguson. All of these agencies have been used or have been targeted by federal consent decree programs, right? Just for fun's sake, right? This is the statute that allows us, the section 14141 of the 1994 Violent Crime and Law Enforcement, or Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, right? Just for reference. So, this is, it's kind of a big deal that this is used and has the power to really dramatically affect lives throughout incorrect misbehavior, especially when there aren't any, really good options other than this. So what do we know about it, right? So we go through this time and effort, it's really invasive. It's a long-standing process. A lot of communities are upset that they're being targeted. A lot of police departments are upset. In general, what is it? How does this work, right? So it's really, because this has been around even though it's been around for, 25 plus years, right? There's not a whole lot known about it, and that's been because a few agencies have been targeted, and a lot of policing research is focused on other areas. So a big thing that comes up with evidence, right, of what we do know is that there does tend to be a reduction in, police harms. And that's, when I say police harms, I mean things like searches and seizures. I mean use of force. I mean being rude and stuff like that. There does tend to be showing a reduction. There's really no evidence of a crime thing. One of the things that President Trump has often said about this program is that he doesn't want to do it because officers feel disgruntled, and when they're disgruntled, they're less likely to be more proactive, and crime runs amok. And to date, there really isn't any evidence of that occurring with consent decree agencies, right? So that part's good. With respect to the other part is that there's also limited evidence about whether or not a police agency improves its relationship with the community. But what evidence does say is there is, moderate evidence that, public opinion, we'll call PO, increases. They have a better view of the police department after they go through this process. So that part is good. Part of it, this whole thing about reforming, is not only to limit abuses, but to also repair a relationship with the community. So that is something that is desirable. In a paper that I wrote, and you could look this up if you were so inclined, although I'm not sure if you'd find it interesting, right? There also tends to be a reduction in lawsuits filed against an agency. So they're called Section 1983 lawsuits. So in some ways, right, we could see because there's fewer lawsuits, people are less likely to, like file it because less abuses are happening. Or, alternatively, you could use lawsuits as a proxy for public opinion. And because there's less lawsuits, people in general are maybe more satisfied. Take that for what it is, right? It's not the best measure, but it is a measure. I guess is the take-home message of that. Not the best, but it is something, right? But something that we have to be kind of cautious about is that a lot of these effects seem to gradually occur over time, which makes sense, right? Like once the reform process happens, right, it does take a while to implement. That would fit the narrative of the process. People have to engage in it for some time. But they also seem to be temporary, in the sense that like when they're temporary, like they fall off once oversight ends. So the police departments may go back to their old ways rather than maintaining an organizational change committed to preventing police reform. Now, many times, right, agencies are motivated to meet the terms of their agreement so they get out of oversight, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're committed to limiting police use of force always and forever, right? And this creates a huge problem, really, is this really going to be effective? Because we want long-standing permanent change, not something that's going to be, in place for, 5 years or however long, right? We want, like maybe forever would be great. Or probably permanent, limited harm reduction practices. So the issue now is that under the Trump administration, there's been limited application of the program and, really an effort to kind of circumvent and close this down. But so it'll be interesting to see what happens, in the future if this program gets more life, if it's used more frequently to address police harms. Is it something that will, maybe more viable or can be used in such a way to be more useful, right? So with that, we'll end this special topic video, but hope you guys enjoyed it. It'll definitely be on the exam.